Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
Election Day approaches. On November 8th, millions of Americans will cast their ballot for the presidential election. Are you registered to vote? Did you know that in Minnesota, you can vote early before Election Day? This month on Access Minnesota, we sit down with Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon to discuss voter registration and the ways Minnesota law makes it easier to vote. Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Pleasure to be with you.
Minnesota had led the nation in voter turnout for many elections, but the state dropped to number 6 in the rankings in the last midterm election in 2014. Do we know why the voter turnout fell in the state?
You know, we really don't know exactly why. It's a question that we pose to a lot of people around the state. We only collect so much information. We collect information on age, for example, and where people live. But it was as much or more about other states sort of upping their game, so to speak, as it was about us somehow faltering. Minnesota is traditionally and has remained, despite that dip, in sort of the elite among states in terms of voting, always in the top 5 or 6 or something like that. And I suspect will be the same this year. I have challenged this year all of us in Minnesota to get us back to number 1. We know what it takes. We owned that spot for a very long time, and I'm confident that we can get there, particularly in this election year of high interest and high intensity.
Are you somewhat concerned this year, though, when you have 2 major party presidential candidates that have historically high unfavorability ratings? Are you concerned that could impact voter turnout?
Well, there are 2 schools of thought there. One school is, precisely as the question suggests, that because these are 2 candidates that, let me be diplomatic, inspire strong feelings, that's how I put it, they inspire strong feelings, and that might, in some quarters, depress turnout, depending on the feeling that they inspire. On the other hand, I tend to think that Minnesota is in the other school, and I'm an adherent of that school, which is through good times and bad, high controversy and low, Minnesotans have embraced voting. We are doers, we are joiners, we are voters, and I have a hunch that even if that phenomenon might exist in other portions of the country, that in Minnesota it will not be depressed turnout, and we will see the typical normal presidential year spike in voter turnout.
Tell us about the historical voter patterns that we see here in the state. When do we see high voter turnout, and when is turnout typically lower?
Well, in one respect, Minnesota is like virtually everywhere else in the country, in the sense that during presidential election cycles, turnout goes up, and during non-presidential cycles, it goes down. And that up and down has been more and more pronounced as time has gone on. The ups have been higher, and the downs have been lower. In terms of a modern high, 2008, we reached north of 78% turnout. That was number 1 in the country, but it was high even for Minnesota. And in terms of lows, there were some elections, midterm elections in the 90s that were quite low. What I can say is that we were routinely in that elite group of states, half dozen or so states in terms of voter turnout. I would say this about presidential elections as well, since we're in one right now. They tend generally to be higher in the years where there is an open seat presidential election, where we're not only electing a president, we know we are electing the next president, no matter who we vote for, because there's no incumbent. This is such a year, obviously, 2008, the last time, was our modern day high. So that's another reason why I think it bodes well this fall for high turnout in Minnesota.
Do we know the most common reasons why people choose not to vote?
You know, there is some survey data out there, and I'll tell you what my experience with those numbers and others have been. Some people don't vote because of barriers that are out there, either in the law or otherwise. They don't know about certain conveniences in the law that would enable them to skip a polling place entirely, believe that they have to go to a polling place, and perhaps can't get a ride. For some people, it's a matter of a foreign language barrier. These are American citizens, but when it comes to technical matters, they prefer things in their own native language, as any of us would. And in some states and in some circumstances, they can't get those. But I have to say there are other kinds of barriers and reasons people don't vote that have nothing to do with structure. They're mental sort of attitude barriers. That's tougher to address. You can't as easily pass a law or eliminate a barrier that would cause some sort of a different behavior there. I'm talking, of course, about people who are disillusioned or disappointed or even disgusted with the way that politics is practiced these days. And while I certainly understand that impulse, we've all felt it from time to time, what I really ask of people who have that feeling and that impulse is to overcome it to not give into it, to not surrender that right to vote, even if not any of the major candidates, to vote for someone, even a write-in, to register that complaint at the ballot box, not outside of it. So I like to sort of quote the words I saw on a t-shirt some time ago, which summarize for me how we should think about this. It said, failure to vote is not an act of rebellion, it's an act of surrender. And so there is that impulse out there, which I certainly do understand, but I think we got to get past it and overcome it. And Minnesotans, to their credit, normally do.
How can we combat voter apathy?
Well, I'll tell you, it depends what kind of apathy. There's the apathy that comes from believing, perhaps falsely, that it's some big complicated mess to vote and that it's a time-consuming hassle. So one way to counteract voter apathy is to just get the word out there about what exists right now in Minnesota law that really favors voter convenience. For example, in Minnesota, we have same-day or election day voter registration. We're one of only 11 states that has it. And that means that in Minnesota, you don't have to pre-register before the election. You can roll out of bed that day and go right to your polling place, or letting people know, because they might not, that you can register online by going to mnvotes.org, which is our election website. Or you can vote no excuses absentee without having to have an excuse anymore for why you need an absentee ballot. You can order that absentee ballot by going to mnvotes.org. So that's one subset of apathy. But the other subset is the apathy that comes from people who are disappointed or disillusioned or disgusted. There, I think some of the onus is on the candidates and the campaigns, and our office certainly can provide information about voting and ease of registration and casting a ballot, but we can't instill in someone, at least not by ourselves, who is otherwise cynical about the process or the candidates or the effect of their one vote. It's harder for us in our office to instill that confidence where it doesn't exist. What we can do is instill confidence in the integrity of the system, the integrity of the tallying, the counting, the transmission of the ballots, so that anyone who might be tempted to skip an election because of doubts there won't be skipping that election, because they'll understand that we have a decentralized, highly ethical, honest, secure system that makes sure that the voice of the people is heard.
When Access Minnesota returns, we'll look at new initiatives from the Secretary of State's office that hope to boost voter turnout among younger voters.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Back to our conversations with Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon and how we can inspire young voters to get to the ballot box. Let's talk about some of the challenges of getting younger people to the polls.
Sure.
Particularly like the Minnesota Students Vote Initiative and the Minnesota College Bowl ballot. What are those programs designed to accomplish?
Sure. To me, they are about getting good habits started early. When young people think of themselves as voters, even before they actually are voters, before they're eligible, they are far more likely then to cast that first ballot when they're eligible, when they're 18, 19, 20, or whatever. And if they do that, if they vote that first time that they're eligible, they're then a lot more likely throughout life to make it a lifetime habit. And that's a good thing that we should encourage. So, as your question suggests, we've started two initiatives in Minnesota that are brand new this year, never been tried. One in high schools, one in colleges. The one in high schools is called Students Vote 2016. It's the first ever statewide mock election for high school students in Minnesota. Other schools from time to time in Minnesota do have mock elections in the high school, but it's sort of limited to the four walls of the school as opposed to being interconnected. Now, hundreds of schools have already signed up, high schools that is, and it means that kids in Bemidji will be able to see how kids in Moorhead or Minneapolis or Mankato or anywhere else in the state are voting. It's very geographically diverse. They'll only be voting on the one contest, President of the United States, and we will supply the ballots. We will collect the information at the end, and in the middle, the schools get to decide how they want to conduct their elections. Some want it to be classroom-led or faculty-led. Others want it to be student-led with tables in the cafeteria. That's up to them, not us. The important thing is to get them thinking about voting and about the candidates. On the college level, we're also importing a concept that's new to Minnesota, never been tried, that we are calling Ballot Bowl 2016. That is simply a competition between and among college campuses in Minnesota to register voters. It will include 2-year, 4-year schools, public, private. We've got great buy-in and participation from both on the administrative side of these colleges and universities and on the student government and student activist side as well. So we hope that will bear fruit, so to speak. It's worked well in a couple of other states. It's new to Minnesota. We're trying it out this year, and we think it can generate some extra added enthusiasm on campus.
How does Minnesota reach out to voters for whom English is not their native language?
Very important question. You know, we have to accommodate our new Minnesotans and our new Americans here. And to me, this is a personal issue. My mother was an immigrant from Austria, and I know from her experience how important this can be. My mom spoke fluent, almost accent-free English. She sounded nothing like her fellow countryman Arnold Schwarzenegger, who has a very thick Austrian accent. She didn't have that, almost no accent. And yet I know from her experience that when it came to something technical, whether it was an appliance warranty or a government document, she much preferred something in her native language, as any of us would. If I were living in Russia or China and knew the language there and was fluent in the language, I suspect I would probably prefer something in English when it came to technical instructions. Same thing for our new Minnesotans. So our office has, I'm proud to say, doubled the number of languages that we service from 5 to 11. We're now at 11 languages, and they reflect the demographic reality of Minnesota. And incidentally, another interesting fact here is that Minnesota's been doing this very thing since 1896. 1896, 120 years. We started in 1896 in this office and in this state printing elections-related instructions and materials in foreign languages. The only difference between then and now is the languages. Then it was Swedish and Norwegian and German and Italian and others. Now they're different languages. It's Spanish, it's Somali, it's Russian, it's Chinese, it's Lao, etc. That's the only difference. There is no other principal difference. So we're merely extending what Minnesota has been doing for 120 years, and that's in our best traditions.
Minnesota has made it easier to vote early and absentee. How does early absentee voting work?
Well, maybe it's best to discuss it in terms of the old rule versus the new rule. The old rule, before this was passed by the legislature a couple of years ago, was that if you wanted to vote absentee, that, as the name implies, you had to show or promise that you were going to be absent, or you had to show or promise that you were really, really sick and would functionally be absent. You couldn't make it to a polling place. Well, there was a lot of sort of white lying going on, and there are no absentee ballot police roving the neighborhoods, seeing if someone's really out of town. And so the legislature decided, I was in the legislature at the time, and I carried this legislation, decided to get rid of the excuse. It didn't serve any function or purpose anymore. As a result now, it means that any one of us who's eligible to vote can vote absentee for any reason or no reason. We can go to mnvotes.org, that same website. We can order an absentee ballot. It can come to our home, and we can vote from our couch, from our kitchen table, for any reason. It's no one's business anymore what reason we give. We don't have to give one. Or you can still vote absentee in person, the old-fashioned way, by going to a city hall or going to a government office of some kind. And if you're unsure what that is, anyone can just go to mnvotes.org and find out what that is. But it's a way for people, in essence, to vote from home. And we have a long absentee ballot period in this state, 46 days. So September 23rd till the election is the period in which people can vote absentee. So they can take days or even weeks to vote, depending on whether they order it early enough. The key thing about absentee voting is that the absentee ballot has to be at the government office, mailed back, and arrive by election day. Not postmarked, has to arrive by election day. So that's how it's worked. In 2014, which was its first kind of experimental unveiling in Minnesota, a lot of people used it, and I expect that this year and in years to come, people are going to really take to it, and they're going to embrace it, as so many have, as a kind of a newfound freedom and flexibility to vote.
How concerned are election officials this year in particular over vote tampering or potential hacking?
Right. Huge issue, ripped from the headlines. Obviously, we've seen a lot of coverage nationwide and elsewhere on alleged hacking by some folks in Russia of the Democratic National Committee. Also alleged Russian hacking of 2 state voter databases in Illinois and Arizona. One was successful, so to speak, and one was nearly successful but not successful, but still raised some eyebrows. And so it's no wonder that I get a lot of inquiries there. So it's always a concern. We always have to stay a step or two ahead of the bad guys. But I'm here to tell you that I think right now we're in a very good place. And the reason I say that is Minnesota has a fundamental feature of its system that makes it far less likely that we'd be subject to those kinds of intrusions, and that is that Minnesota is still, in this day and age, a paper-based system. Ironic, I think, that in this high-tech age, good old-fashioned paper can be our savior. So in Minnesota, as your viewers who have voted no, we still vote with pen and paper. You go into that ballot booth and you've got a pen and a piece of paper. It's not a fancy touch screen or machine or anything like that. That's it. And yes, it's true that you feed that ballot on election day into a machine, but under state law that may not, must not, shall not be connected to the internet during the polling place hours or any of the tabulation. There's always a paper trail because there's a paper receipt, and under state law, we have to keep the ballots, the actual physical paper ballots, for close to 2 years. So for example, if someone alleges after the election that some foreign source or domestic source or an individual or a group or anyone got into the system and, let's say, added a 0 or 2 onto someone's vote total or subtracted a 0 or 2 from someone's vote total, we have the actual ballots that we can go back to. And this proposition has been tested in some of our state recounts. Now, those weren't hacking issues, but we know we have the wherewithal and we have the infrastructure to do that, and we have done it in the past. And so that's kind of the fail-safe, that's the ultimate shield. But we're always trying to stay one step ahead. I've put together an IT security team here at the office. We are in the process right now of working with an outside private sector vendor to do an IT audit. It always helps to have an extra set of ears and eyes to look around, find vulnerabilities, tell us what they are, help us plug any holes, and that'll all be done well in time for Election Day. And so we're taking the precautions we need to take, but fortunately the fundamental architecture of our system is paper-based, and I think that should give a lot of people peace of mind.
Are you eligible to vote? When Access Minnesota returns, Secretary of State Steve Simon goes over the voter eligibility rules.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
This month on Access Minnesota, we're making sure voters are prepared for Election Day on November 8th. Here's more of our conversation with Secretary of State Steve Simon. Let's go over voter eligibility. Who is eligible to vote, and what information and identification does someone need in order to vote?
Sure. Well, the eligibility to vote in Minnesota is spelled out in our Constitution. It's basically that you need to be 18 years old, you need to be a resident of the state of Minnesota, you need to be a citizen of the United States, and you can't currently be serving a felony sentence. Once those 4 requisites are satisfied, that person is eligible to vote. In terms of what someone has to show, so if you go to mnvotes.org and register before the election, it can be as simple as providing a driver's license number or the last 4 digits of a social security number. If someone registers in person on Election Day, again, we're one of 11 states that has same day or Election Day voter registration. If someone seeks to register that day, there's a whole combination of documents and proofs that a person can use. It's not one size fits all, to prove 2 things. And this is the key in Minnesota. In Minnesota, you need to prove 2 things. You are who you say you are, and you live where you say you live. And there's a whole combination of documents you could use. It could be an expired driver's license. It could be a utility bill. It could even include someone in your neighborhood or in your precinct, to be official, who can vouch for you. My own dad had to be vouched for to vote in a past election when he and my mom moved from our childhood home to a new home. They moved in October. They didn't even have a utility bill. That's how close to the election they had moved there. And he had someone vouch for him. So anyone who wants to know what combination of things they need, and there are probably too many to mention in this interview, can go to mnvotes.org and find out what they can use to prove those 2 things. They are who they say they are, and they live where they say they live.
How can someone volunteer to be an election judge?
Well, election judges are typically hired by and trained by people at the local level. In the metro area, that tends to be cities, and in greater Minnesota, that tends to be counties, depending on where you live, obviously. And so if anyone's interested in being an election judge, they should contact either their county auditor, typically charged with the election administration function, or someone with a similar description in their city who's in charge of elections. And that person would be happy, believe me, to accept any applications and any help. And incidentally, it takes 30,000 people to run an election in Minnesota. We have 2 every election year. We have a primary and we have a general. And starting in 2020, we're going to have a 3rd one, which is a presidential primary. So it takes a lot of people, an army. And I strongly encourage people to consider doing it. It's a great public service. You do get paid, although no one does it to get rich, and you won't get rich, but you will get a stipend. And it's a great way to contribute and see firsthand just what a great system we have and how honest it is and how secure it really is.
Let's talk for a moment about the caucus system in Minnesota. This year there was an extraordinarily good turnout in many caucuses, unusually large turnout, and that led to lines and delays and some frustration. What changes will be made to the caucus system going forward to make that process more manageable?
Right. Well, I think your question really gets to the heart of it. In a way, the caucus system was a victim of its own success. It's not a criticism. If anything, it's a compliment. So many people were inspired to show up and turn out and make their voices heard to select a presidential nominee for their party that it really did overwhelm the capacity of the system to handle it. After all, workers at political party units are volunteers. They're not paid, and we're really asking a lot of them to run basically a quasi-election in Minnesota. And there were a lot of people who were turned away or certainly turned off by the crowds and the lines and the commotion. And legislators reacted with surprising, I guess, intensity and support this last legislative session. And so going forward, starting in 2020, there will be a presidential primary in lieu of a caucus. Now, that means that voters will go to the polls in a real election, just like the primary and just like the general election at their normal polling place, to elect or to register their approval or disapproval for candidates and to select a nominee for their presidential party, just like a normal election. The advantage there is more sort of on-ramps for participation, a professionally run election. In a caucus system, despite its many advantages, one of the disadvantages is there is no absentee period. If you can't make it there in person at 7 p.m. on probably snowy Tuesday in the winter, you're out. If you're in the military, if you can't get a babysitter, if school conflicts or work conflicts, that's it. There is no other avenue. Here, people will be able to participate. Now, the good news for those who admire much about the caucus system, the town hall feel, the exchange of ideas and issue, the face-to-face meeting with neighbors, or the endorsement process for other contests, the good news is all of that's staying. So the new legislation carves out an exception only for this one office of President of the United States, and only, obviously, once every 4 years. The entire rest of the caucus system will remain. So all of that other stuff, the debating the platform issues, the endorsing candidates for every other office from top to bottom, that's going to stay totally unchanged. Just a carve out for this office every 4 years, real election across Minnesota.
Where can people go to find out more information about voting in Minnesota?
Well, I think the best overall resource is our election website, which is mnvotes.org. That's mnvotes.org. People can find information about the candidates. People can click on a feature called My Ballot, which will tell them based on their address what their ballot looks like, who and what is up for election, where they live, what they'll be voting on. They can find where their polling place is. They can register to vote there. They can order an absentee ballot. They can fill out an absentee ballot application there. There are so many resources there that make registration and voting quick, easy, and hassle-free, and we're very proud of it. So mnvotes.org, I would recommend to anyone as a one-stop shop for election resources.
Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. We'll see you again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.